I walked into that boardroom at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, carrying a leather portfolio that held 18 months of architecture diagrams, integration maps, and compliance matrices I had personally built from the ground up. The acquisition had closed 6 weeks earlier. Our smaller firm, a boutique consultancy specializing in federal contract compliance and secure data architecture, absorbed into a mid-market tech conglomerate that wanted our client list and our certifications but had no idea what either actually required to maintain. I was the only woman at the table. I was also the only person in that room who understood how the systems actually worked, how the contracts were structured, and what would happen if any single component failed an audit, but none of that mattered to him. His name was Derek Pullman, Senior Vice President of Enterprise Solutions, a title that sounded impressive until you realized he had spent the last decade selling vaporware to Fortune 500 companies and had never once opened a technical specification document. He sat at the head of the table in a slate gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, flanked by two of his loyalists, Mark, the CFO who nodded at everything Derek said, and Ian, the director of product who had been hired 3 months before the acquisition, and whose only qualification seemed to be that he went to the same business school as Derek. There were 4 other men in the room, all from Derek's side, all watching me with the kind of polite disinterest you reserve for someone you've already decided doesn't matter. I was there because my integration playbook was the only thing standing between the merged entity and a catastrophic failure of every federal contract we had inherited. The meeting was supposed to be a technical review. It became something else entirely. Derek opened with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said my name wrong. Not badly wrong, just wrong enough that I knew he hadn't bothered to learn it, even though we had been in 3 prior meetings and my email signature was visible on every document he had supposedly reviewed. He introduced me to the room as the compliance lead from the acquisition and gestured vaguely in my direction, as though I were a piece of furniture that had come with the building. Then he opened his laptop, pulled up a slide deck I had never seen before, and began to present my own work diagrams I had created, terminology I had coined, risk assessments I had written, as though he had discovered them himself. He didn't credit me, he didn't even look at me. He simply took my architecture, stripped it of context, oversimplified it to the point of uselessness, and presented it as his vision for the integration. When he reached the section on FedRAMP compliance, he actually said the words, "We don't need to overcomplicate this, we can just migrate everything to Oz and call it a day." I felt my jaw tighten. FedRAMP certification is not a checkbox. It is a multi-year, multi-million-dollar process that requires continuous monitoring, boundary controls, and third-party attestation. You cannot just migrate to Oz. You cannot hand-wave your way through federal compliance. But Derek had never worked a federal contract in his life and he didn't care. I raised my hand, not interrupting, just signaling, and he ignored me. I raised it again and he glanced at me with the kind of patronizing half-smile you give a child who is trying to speak at the adult table. Finally, when I opened my mouth to interject, he cut me off mid-breath. "I appreciate your enthusiasm," he said, "but let's let the technical team handle the technical details." The technical team, as though I were not the architect. As though I had not spent 2 years building the infrastructure he was now casually dismantling in a PowerPoint. Mark nodded, Ian nodded, the other men looked at their phones, and Derek moved on to the next slide. I did not speak again for the rest of the meeting. I sat there, my hands folded on the table, my face carefully neutral, and I watched him dismantle my work piece by piece. He proposed shortcuts that would violate audit requirements. He suggested timelines that were physically impossible given the certification cycles. He used technical terms incorrectly, confusing encryption standards, conflating boundary controls with access policies, mixing up compliance frameworks as though they were interchangeable. And every time he said something wrong, the men around the table nodded as though he had just revealed a profound insight. No one questioned him, no one asked for my input. At one point, Derek actually said, "We need to move fast and break things." and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing, because the only thing we were going to break was a $40 million contract with the Department of Defense if we followed his plan. When the meeting ended, Derek closed his laptop, stood up, and thanked everyone for their time. He did not thank me. He did not ask if I had questions. He simply walked out of the room, followed by his entourage, leaving me sitting alone at the table with my unopened portfolio. I stayed there for a full minute, staring at the empty chairs, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over me like a cold, heavy fog. I had been erased, not fired, not dismissed, erased. My work had been stolen, my expertise ignored, and my presence reduced to a formality. And the worst part was that no one in that room had even noticed. I did not go back to my desk. I went to the parking garage, got in my car, and sat there in silence for 20 minutes, replaying the meeting in my head. I could feel the rage building, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, methodical kind that sharpens your thinking and clarifies your priorities. I had two choices. I could escalate through HR, file a complaint, request a follow-up meeting, and hope that someone in leadership would take me seriously. Or I could do what I do best: gather information, map the system, identify the weaknesses, and execute a strategy so precise that no one would see it coming until it was too late. I chose the second option. That night I went home, opened my laptop, and began to build a file. Not a formal complaint, something better. I started with Derek's presentation, the one he had given that morning. I pulled the original diagrams from my archive, complete with version history, timestamps, and metadata showing that I had created them 14 months earlier. I pulled the email threads where I had outlined the integration strategy, the risk assessments I had written, and the architecture documents I had submitted to the executive team before the acquisition closed. Then I cross-referenced Derek's slide deck against the technical reality. Every shortcut he proposed, I documented. Every compliance violation, I annotated. Every impossible timeline, I mapped against the actual certification requirements. I built a side-by-side comparison showing his plan versus the legally mandated process, complete with citations from NISD 853, FedRAMP control baselines, and the specific contract clauses that would trigger penalty fees if we failed an audit. The file was 62 pages long. It was airtight. And it was only the beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, I did not confront Derek. I did not send angry emails. I did not complain to HR. Instead, I attended every meeting he called, took meticulous notes, and watched him dig himself deeper. He continued to present my work as his own. He continued to propose shortcuts that violated federal requirements. And he continued to ignore me, treating me as though I were invisible. But I was not invisible, I was gathering evidence. Every meeting, every email, every Slack message where he dismissed my input or overrode my recommendations went into the file. I documented his technical errors. I documented his timeline commitments. I documented every single moment where he had taken credit for my work or ignored a compliance risk I had flagged. And then I waited. The catalyst came 5 weeks after the initial meeting. Derek had scheduled a kickoff call with the Department of Defense contracting officer, a woman named Sandra Chen who had worked federal compliance for 15 years and did not tolerate incompetence. Derek had prepared a presentation outlining his integration plan, the same plan that violated half a dozen audit requirements and would have resulted in immediate decertification if implemented. He had not invited me to the call, but Sandra had. She had emailed me directly the day before, asking for a technical review of the proposed architecture, and I had responded with a polite, professional email attaching my original integration plan, the real one, the one that actually complied with federal standards, along with a note that I was available to answer any questions. Derek did not know I had sent it. He walked into that call expecting to impress a client with his vision. Instead, Sandra opened with a question that made my chest tighten with satisfaction. I reviewed the architecture documents and I have some concerns about the timeline and the certification path. Can someone walk me through the boundary controls and the continuous monitoring plan? Derek froze. He had no idea what she was talking about. He stumbled through a vague answer about leveraging cloud infrastructure and streamlining compliance, and Sandra cut him off. "I need specifics," she said. "Who is the technical lead on this integration?" There was a long pause. And then, for the first time in 6 weeks, Derek said my name. I was on the call. I had joined muted, waiting. When Derek finally acknowledged me, I unmuted, introduced myself, and began to walk Sandra through the actual architecture, not Derek's fantasy version, but the compliant, auditable, technically sound integration plan I had designed. I explained the boundary controls. I outlined the continuous monitoring framework. I detailed the certification timeline and the third-party attestation process. Sandra asked follow-up questions, and I answered every single one with precision and clarity. Derek said nothing, Mark said nothing, Ian said nothing. By the time the call ended, Sandra had thanked me personally, confirmed that the integration plan met federal requirements, and scheduled a follow-up technical review with me, not Derek. After the call disconnected, there was silence on the internal line. Then Derek's voice, tight and clipped, "We need to talk." When I returned an hour later, there was a meeting invite in my inbox. Integration strategy alignment, scheduled for the following morning, attendees including Derek, Mark, Ian, and the chief legal officer. I accepted the invite without comment. That night, I finalized the file. I added the recording of the DoD call. Our internal system auto-archived all client meetings, along with a transcript highlighting every moment where Derek had fumbled a technical question and every moment where I had provided the correct answer. I added a summary document written in clean, corporate language, outlining the risks of proceeding with Derek's plan and the potential financial and legal consequences of noncompliance. Then I sent the entire file to 3 people: the chief legal officer, the chief operating officer, and the external counsel who had handled the acquisition. I did not send it to HR. I did not send it to Derek. I sent it to the people who had the authority to act and the responsibility to protect the company from catastrophic failure. The subject line read, "Federal Compliance Risk Assessment, Immediate Review Required." Derek was already there, sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Mark and Ian. The chief legal officer, a woman named Karen Delgado, was sitting across from them, her laptop open, her expression unreadable. She looked up when I entered, nodded once, and gestured for me to sit. Derek did not look at me. The meeting started exactly on time. Karen opened by saying that she had reviewed the integration plan and had some questions about compliance risk. Derek launched into his standard pitch: fast timelines, streamlined processes, cloud migration, and Karen let him talk for about 90 seconds before she interrupted. "I read the risk assessment," she said, looking directly at me. "Walk me through the FedRAMP certification path." I did. I explained the control baselines, the boundary architecture, the continuous monitoring requirements, and the attestation process. I explained why Derek's shortcuts would result in immediate decertification and penalty fees that could exceed $15 million. I explained why the timeline he had proposed was not just optimistic but legally impossible. And then I pulled up my original architecture documents, showed the version history, and demonstrated that every diagram Derek had presented as his own had been created by me more than a year earlier. Karen asked one question: "Why wasn't this flagged sooner?" I answered carefully. "I flagged it in every meeting. My input was not included in the decision-making process." Derek's face went white. Mark shifted in his seat. Ian stared at his laptop. Karen closed hers. "We'll reconvene after I speak with the executive team," she said. The meeting ended. 3 days later, Derek was removed from the integration project, not fired, reassigned. He was moved to a business development role with no direct reports and no involvement in technical operations. Mark remained in his position but was no longer the primary stakeholder on the integration. Ian was let go quietly, his departure framed as a strategic realignment. I was named the official technical lead for the integration, reporting directly to the COO with full authority over architecture, compliance, and vendor management. My title changed, my salary changed. And for the first time since the acquisition, I was treated like the expert I had always been. The integration took 11 months. We passed every audit. We maintained every certification. The DoD contract renewed without incident, and 2 additional federal clients signed on based on our compliance track record. Derek and I never spoke again. I would see him occasionally in the hallway or in all-hands meetings, and he would look past me as though I didn't exist, the same way he had looked past me in that first boardroom. But the difference now was that everyone else saw me. They saw my work, they saw the value I brought. And they saw what happened when someone tried to take credit for something they didn't build. I did not humiliate Derek publicly. I did not write a scathing email or stage a dramatic confrontation. I simply documented the truth, presented it to the people who mattered, and let the system correct itself. That is the power of precision. That is the power of knowing your domain so thoroughly that no one can question your expertise. And that is the power of patience, of waiting for the exact right moment and then striking so cleanly that no one even realizes they've been cut until the damage is already done. Derek humiliated me in that boardroom. He dismissed my work, ignored my expertise, and treated me as though I were irrelevant. But he made one critical mistake. He assumed that silence meant defeat. It didn't. It meant I was building a case. And by the time he realized what was happening, it was far too late to stop it.